Now we're headed into a segment of the show that we are going to call Dr. J Answers. We realized when we started Screeching or Teaching, which is another segment of the show, we realized that that's really sort of a sub-segment that I'm answering not only Christian thinkers, non-Christian thinkers out there on the web, but also you, the listener. Someone who's submitted a question, if you had a comment, maybe an objection specifically to something that I said, and that I would also be providing answers to those questions and comments. So the second half of the Veracity Hill program we'll call Dr. J Answers, and it could be any sort of type of segment, but today in particular I wanted to address a few. There have been some comments and questions from the last couple episodes, and so I wanted to track back and follow up with some people who had questions and some comments. So the first one I want to start off with is from one of our listeners, Chris. And he writes regarding the state of theology and pastors not teaching the historic creeds. He says, I had your average evangelical upbringing, Baptist churches, and I was a sophomore before I had even heard of the Nicene Creed. In my church history class is homeschool. I had not heard one syllable of any creed in church, and I never did until I started going to an Anglican church. Evangelifish, I guess it's sort of a little insult there from Chris. Evangelifish couldn't care less about historic Christianity. Well, evangelicals couldn't care less about historic Christianity. Well, I mean, Chris, thanks for your comment there and thanks for listening. One thing I would want to give a little pushback on is you say that you're at an Anglican, started going to an Anglican church. Would you say that there are evangelicals that are Anglicans? So how are we defining an evangelical? There are some Baptist churches, there are non-denom churches that might say, hey, Christianity started 30 years ago with a founding pastor, right? And of course, that is a huge problem. I think there is a cultural shift for some millennials and even Gen Zers who are seeking to be part of a greater tradition. That's why there's an appeal for people to become Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or even Anglican. You have this robust sense of liturgy and tradition, but also church tradition changes and evolves. Let me say this, a tradition that was started in the 4th century or 8th century or 12th century that continues on doesn't mean that that was the way church was done in the 1st century or the 2nd century. Now, I certainly don't want to reinvent the theological wheel, as many Christians are apt to do by forgetting the creeds. You listened to the program when I was reviewing the state of theology. Pastors have failed to pass on the historic Christian faith. That said, maybe we do give too much credence sometimes to tradition where it might not belong. Let me give you a specific example that I hold to. The Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, as others call it. The Lord's Supper was a meal. It was a meal to be had and eaten with fellow believers. Whenever you do this, right? Whenever you eat the bread and drink this cup, what has the Lord's Supper become? The Lord's Supper has become institutionalized because now you stand up, you walk in a line up to the front, you take your little piece of bread, you eat it, you might sip your cup or you've got a little mini cup, maybe if they pass it along the pews. This is not the same thing as what Jesus taught his disciples to do. It's not. We have found a way to institutionalize the event. And while it is still nice to reflect on the atoning work of cross and everything else that all that entails, it's just not the same thing. So I applaud churches that do potlucks because the churches that do potlucks are far closer to the meaning of Jesus' teaching in the Lord's Supper than those churches that perform the institutionalized version of the Lord's Supper. There's your provocative thought for the week. That's a personal case for me where I think what became a tradition of the church, a different tradition, an evolved tradition, people still like. I think it's a big problem when churches don't do anything, but that tradition is something that we don't necessarily have to say represents the early church or even represents the Lord's teaching. Something to think about. Thanks for your comment. Feel free to let me know. Give me pushback, especially if you're Anglican. I'll probably get a lot of pushback on my thoughtful response there. We've got some other comments. I started, responding to Dan McClellan on Screeching or Teaching, and we had some people on my Facebook who kind of applauded me for doing that, and it's something I want to do. If you've got more clips of Dan McClellan and you'd like me to respond to, send them my way. Matthew says, it's hard to take Dan seriously, although some people obviously do. I'm glad you're doing this series, much needed. Well, thank you, Matthew. I appreciate that. yeah, obviously I'm doing it now because I think it is needed. And Dan has this, I don't know, maybe smug is the right word. I mean, he just gives off this aura that he's studied and that he knows the right answer always. There's a way of teaching people, but without coming across as arrogant or smug. It can be hard to do for people who are studied and know a subject matter. I would point people, I'm an expert on the Gallic monks, the so-called semi-Pelagians. That's my wheelhouse because I spent 5 years researching and writing on these guys. Some of Dan McClellan's videos are simply him stating to the public what other scholars believe, the general consensus. And it's not actually an argument in some of his videos. And yet he still gives off this aura. And it's just, it's annoying. So hence why I feel the need to create screeching or teaching. David says, glad to see more people responding to this guy. And then we've got James Michael Smith. Screeching or Teaching is a fantastic title. Thank you, JM. Much appreciated. Glad to see your YouTube channel is growing. Thanks for your comment. Really, not just growing, JM, but as I've described, it's going nuclear. I mean, it's blown up for you, so very happy to see the dojo growing. Then we had a critique, a response from a fellow named John. And so I want to spend a few moments going over John's comments here. He says 3 points here. And so I'll read them for you. He says, I have a few comments with your response. When Dan says the algebra of New Testament claims don't necessarily resolve one way, he's not using that in the philosophical sense. I think he is actually using that in the philosophical sense. Looking at John chapter 8. What Dan is doing is he's basically trying to prevent Christians from saying it doesn't have to be read that Jesus is claiming to be God. When I said that it's contingently the case because the evidence does suggest that. So yes, I'll grant that it doesn't necessarily have to be interpreted a certain way, but rather that the evidence highly suggests that Jesus is claiming to be divine. Not merely to have divine prerogative, but Jesus is claiming to be God. This is why the leaders picked up stones to kill him. They wouldn't have done that if he's merely claiming divine prerogative. But he's saying, before Abraham was, I am. That's the big no-no. You could claim to have divine prerogative and say that you've been sent by God, you're a prophet, this and that, but you're just a human. That wouldn't get you killed, all right? So that's the big indicator. Okay, we've got other things to look at here from John. He says, you say Dan has not met the burden of proof showing that Jesus' use of I am extends only to claiming divine prerogative. Well, I sort of just answered that, that I do think Jesus' use of I am is an unambiguous claim to be God, in contrast to what John is claiming in his comment there. Finally, his last point was regarding the high priestly prayer. John writes, you say that Jesus could be alluding to different senses of oneness in John 8:58 and the high priestly prayer, but at 2 points, Jesus explicitly prays that his disciples would be, quote, just as we are one, end quote. Jesus is clearly praying that the disciples will experience the same kind of oneness among themselves that Jesus enjoys with the Father. Well, again, John, thanks for your comments here. I'll reiterate that is a oneness of unison, of a unison of mission. Being one in spirit and mission is not the same as oneness of identity. Even in that case that you give in John 17:11 and 21, I think that's all it is. When Jesus says, just as we are one, I don't take Jesus to be making a statement of identity there, but a statement of a description of mission and spirit and ethos. That's not the same thing as saying a statement of identity. That's what I would say in reply there, that even the John 17:11 instance doesn't qualify as a counterexample to the oneness there being merely unity. And that's brought up because a couple episodes ago, McClellan argued when Jesus was talking about identity with the Father, it was this sense of prerogative and authority, that type of oneness, being on the same page, one of mission. But in John chapter 8, Jesus is doing far more than that. We do have comments from others. I've got another question. Let's check out. We've got Free Thinking Ministries tuning in. Glad to have you watching today. John the Baptist claimed to have divine prerogative, and the Jewish authorities didn't pick up stones to kill him. Yes, very good point, though he was a social outcast. But you're right. There are others in the Bible that claim a divine prerogative, but which we don't have evidence the Jewish leaders sought to kill. So clearly there's something different about Jesus. There's something different about Jesus in all the Gospels. This is in all the Gospels. He's not merely an apocalyptic preacher. He's not merely a social reformer. He is something else. He is the promised Messiah. He is the Son of Man. And who is the Son of Man? The Son of Man is a divine figure. He is sent by God. John chapter 1, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The question is, what is that relationship? Let me use that to get into this question from Derek from one of the video clips from the Dan McClellan. So I talked about eternal generation, and Derek, whom I went to college with, so thanks, Derek, for tuning in. He wrote, at the end, you mentioned eternal generation. That's a theological concept, a doctrine. Derek says, I couldn't tell if you thought that was heretical or just a passing comment. Could you explain more about your view on that perspective? Yes, I would be delighted to, Derek. Thank you for your question there. I'm sorry that I wasn't clear enough at the outset. There are many Christians today who are, for some reason, rejecting eternal generation. I think because of a hesitancy that label has, that when something's generated, that it's created, but that's not the way that the church fathers would talk about generation. Getting back to the relationship between the Son of Man as a divine figure, think about God as the Father, right? What does it mean to be a father? Well, if you are a father, that means you have children. Well, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only, one and only, or the word begotten son. When you beget, in this sense, it is of you. It's from you. I won't say created, but it's of you and from you. The church fathers, as they were thinking about how to understand these difficult concepts in Scripture and how to understand them and make sense of them as a synthesis of the data. It's not that the data conflicts or contradicts, but rather we see that Jesus is a divine figure. Through him all things were made, but he's also God. So it's not that he began to exist at time T. Jesus is eternal, is an eternal figure. How does this make sense of a father-son relationship? Well, this is where eternal generation comes in as a concept. The Father has from eternity generated the Son. That is how there is of and fromness without there being a time of creation. So that's how the Son is eternal, but he shares the attributes of the Father. What is true of the Father is true of the Son. Just giving a quick answer to you, Derek, I don't think it's a heresy. Quite the opposite. It is Nicene orthodoxy. Eternal generation is a concept of Nicene orthodoxy, the Nicene Creed. Hope that clarifies. I think it's orthodox, strongly so. It's the strong consensus of the church fathers as they were dealing with these tricky subjects. And so eternal generation is quite orthodox. And I think to reject eternal generation will entail, sometimes quicker than others, some sort of heresy. If you reject that, you will have problems with your Christology. No doubt about it. And you might quickly come to say Arianism, for example, that Jesus is a created person. That's not what the church has believed. Chris giving pushback. He is watching today's episode live. Thank you, Chris. Fair pushback, I guess, on the Lord's Supper, I think. I do have more of a pejorative outlook on evangelicalism, hence the tongue-in-cheek evangelifish remark, and many Anglicans would still be evangelical. Yes, great. Good. Glad to have you watching, Chris. I appreciate your comments. If you've got more questions, feel free to submit them. For those who are wondering how you might be able to reach me, there's a few ways. You can write a comment on a YouTube video, and you could go to the website, veracityhill.com. There's a contact form. There's another way, too, and no one has yet taken advantage of this in Season 2 of the Veracity Hill Podcast, and that's to leave a voice message. So if you want to call a phone number and to leave a message for Dr. J, ask me a question, give me some pushback, tell me where I was wrong, you can call 505-2STRIVE. That's 505-278-7483. Yes, it is the same number we've had for years. Again, 505-2STRIVE, because we're striving for truth on complex issues here at Veracity Hill. That's part of our ministry tagline, our slogan, and it's one of the ways that I really see this ministry of Veracity Hill, to equip Christians to reach non-believers with the truth. In a broad sense, we are all striving for truth. We all want to understand what is true of the world, and that requires a lot of work. And sometimes the truth is tricky. It's not so clear-cut. It can be complex. And so we want to clarify those complex issues when we strive for truth. I appreciate the live comments. It's fun to have that spontaneity versus just straight recorded. All Day ML says, super impressive, cool that you're answering questions live off the cuff like this. Thanks, All Day. I could do this all day if I could play off that. No, happy to do it. I really enjoy the spontaneity of the back and forth.